A first in a long time reunion was held for the Beard family April 13th, 2019. In addition, we were joined by some of the Wingard family, descendants of Emma's brother Hill. As far as I know, the items in here are correct, though I would welcome any corrections or additions to the story. Hope it helps you in your family study. These are the reason why most of us are here, with the exception of our other cousins over here. John and Emma were just plain ordinary folks. They didn't claim to be anything special. They didn't try to impress anybody. They just worked hard, raised their kids, and had the best life that they could. I don't know a single person that didn't like them. They were just that likable kind of people. Now this is going to be our roadmap through this whole thing. This is one of my genealogy pages. To get John and Emma in here, I had to have one of their kids. And of course, since it's my presentation, it's my mama's here. But you'll see up through this way, the Beards are here. Come down here, and it goes into some names that you don't know. Wingard goes across this way, and I'll be pointing this out as we go through. Now, recently, I had my DNA test done. Finally got around to it. And question, how many of you heard the story about an Indian princess in our family? I got news for you. Ain't true. When I started all this, I kept anticipating finding that person. And it is, at least as far as direct lineage, it's not there. I wanted something exotic, different in my DNA report. This is my report, and I am as Anglo-Saxon as you can possibly be. It's England, Wales, Northwestern Europe, 62%, Germanic Europe, 18%. That's from both sides of the family, by the way. Norway. Now that one was a surprise, because I haven't found anything going to Norway, except I finally figured something out. The Vikings went over to England. They stayed a few generations, and then they migrated to the United States. So we may be partly Viking. Yeah. I haven't been able to trace that yet.
That's cool.
Ireland and Scotland was no surprise to me. We got a lot of that. So next St. Patrick's Day, you can celebrate with abandon because you are truly Irish. The earliest known ancestor locations that I've been able to find go exactly with what that report showed. These are the different families that I found over in England, Ireland, Scotland, Germany, and France. Some of these I'll point out a little bit as we go. The earliest to this continent of our ancestors, and most of these names you will never have heard of, but these are your grandparents. Generations back. They're your grandparents. Heinrich Kisselberg. Heinrich Kisselberg. John Hobbs. Tell me when you recognize the name. John Hobbs. Sarah Harrell came to North Carolina. Peter Barbary came to Georgia. Now Peter came from France. La Rochelle, Mons, Basse, Normandy, France. Right around the curve from where the D-Day invasion took place. So we're part French. Margaret Davis. Probably don't know that one.
I was named after her.
Yeah.
It's a witness protection thing.
Thomas Talent moved into Virginia. Nicholas Gentry. I bet you never expected Gentry to be in here.
No.
Nicholas came from Essex, right here, just northeast of London. It was and still is a very rural area to be connected with such a big metropolis like it is. Elizabeth Williams came to South Carolina. Hannah Higdon came to Tennessee. James Warren to North Carolina. Elizabeth Harmon to North Carolina. And Mary Simmons to South Carolina. These are all names I've found over the last few years because tracing back, I ran into them. And all of these have been proven with the DNA test that I took. Yes, ma'am.
And these are years from what?
1600s to the latest of ours families that came over was probably around 1800. We have been Americans a long time. In fact, out of all of my whole genealogy tree, the last family to come over was Lammers. And he came in 1867, right after the Civil War.
Jimmy, some of those like 1600 years were like 1650.
Yeah, that was when they were born.
That's incredible. That's like an Elizabethan
Yeah.
England. That's yeah. Wow.
We're talking way back there.
Yeah.
I was a Viking.
You were the Viking, okay.
Now, the entry to the country that you do know. This gets back to the main ones, Emma and John and their parents. They're, of course, the focus of most of what we're going to be doing. Heinrich Kisselberg changed name to Heinrich Castleberry when he moved here. He was born in 1661. He moved into Pennsylvania, to Philadelphia to be exact. He came from Mülheim an der Ruhr, Rhineland, Prussia. It wasn't even Germany yet. It was Prussia when he immigrated. And this is right next to the Netherlands and Belgium, the northwest part of Germany. John Adam Winger. We've all heard that name. He was born in 1726, came to South Carolina. He was from Germany as well, down here in the southwest portion of the country. Not too far from where my sister lived for a few years. There in Germany. She taught at an Air Force school in Germany.
And we didn't know all this then.
Oh no, we didn't know
I
any
would
of
have
this.
gone to do.
John Beard. Where do you think John Beard's family is from? Any guess?
Oh, she's got a guess.
Oh, where?
There.
There, right there.
Tyrone County, Ireland.
There's where it's at.
Tyrone County, Ireland. Right in what's Northern Ireland today. And then finally, Thomas Stapp. I have fought trying to find Cornelia Stapp's family for years. And about 4 months ago, I said, this has to be it. And trace it back to this Thomas, and the DNA test proves that I got the right ones there. They came from, I don't know exactly where, but generally the Stapps come from this part of England right next to Wales, and so most likely that's where our Stapp family came from. Revolutionary War soldiers. Everybody wants to have a Revolutionary War soldier somewhere in their background, right?
Yeah.
So you can get to the Sons of the American Revolution, Daughters of the American Revolution, or whatever. You can take your pick.
Wow.
All right.
We've got 12, I think it is, that are certified Revolutionary War soldiers. Now, I've got Hezekiah Gentry on there, but I've got him in quotes, and there's a reason for that. He was in the war, all right, but he's on the wrong side.
That's, yeah, there we go.
He was a Tory. He was a Tory that remained loyal to England.
You can stay on that other side.
William Rose and Benjamin Rose are father and son. Well, this last one down here, James Dean, is the one that I just found out about. He was a cabinet maker, and some of his cabinets from just post-Revolutionary War time are in museums.
Oh.
He was that special, that good. North Carolina is known for furniture work.
Right.
He's one of the ones that started all that. He had moved down from Pennsylvania, and they can look at his stuff and know it's his work. And there's like 50 pieces that are in museums around the country. Okay, we're gonna come back here and we're gonna focus on James Sumner. I'm gonna just call him James Sumner for right now, as opposed to James Rose, which is Beard. So try to keep it straight. James Sumner lived in Georgia, and we'll be following this map quite a bit. Before we get into it, other than the ones I've talked to about this, when you hear about the worst Civil War battles, which battle names come to mind?
Gettysburg.
Gettysburg, of course. That's number one.
Antietam.
Antietam? Maybe Shiloh?
Yeah, Shiloh.
Okay, that's the ones that generally come up. Let me show you this chart. This thing, I know you can't read it, so I'll tell you about it. Gettysburg was the worst. It's at the top of the list. Shiloh and Antietam fall down here,
Oh.
7th and 8th. Why is that? You ever considered that? Everything above that, except Gettysburg, was either a Confederate victory or a draw. And as the old thing says, the winner writes the history. The North wrote the history on Shiloh and Antietam. But the ones that we, really I'm calling us we because we're all Southern all the way through, they get left out. So we'll run into that a couple more times in all of this as well. James lived in Bartow County. It was Cass County originally. They changed the name. And the war came to that area. Up here in this corner, let me back up. I was going to point something out on this one. This number 2 is Chickamauga. Ever heard of Chickamauga?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was the second deadliest battle of the Civil War. And it took place right there in Dade and Walker counties. It was a Confederate victory. I think the Confederates lost more people, but they drove the Union off the battlefield. And so when they finished there, they kind of wandered around, skirmished a little bit, and then they moved to Chattanooga, Tennessee. That was the next big battle in here. From Chattanooga, Sherman started his march to the sea. You've probably heard about that through the years. And so, when they go into a state, what's going to be one of their main objectives to take over when they go into a state? Capital, of course. So, did you know Milledgeville was the capital of Georgia? Milledgeville. But Atlanta was the shipping and financial center of the state. So he came from up where those battles were to Atlanta. You've seen Gone with the Wind? Mm-hmm. It took place here in Bartow County, where James Sumner was from. Sherman decided he wasn't going to have a long supply line that would limit what he could do. He said, my army's going to live off the land. So they took all the food they needed as they went, and they destroyed the rest. They burned all the cotton, they burned a lot of buildings, and it was devastated. So when James came back, it was a horrible place to live. But he lived there for a while. As he got to Atlanta, he took it, and then his next thing was, well, okay, now we'll go take Milledgeville. And then eventually he wanted to go to Savannah down on the coast. And in doing that, he not only cut Georgia in half, but since they had already taken Tennessee, it cut Virginia, North and South Carolina off from the rest of the Confederacy when he took that section. Once he finished there, he turned north. Sherman doesn't have a very good name among Southern people because they were pretty destructive in this, and it was intentional. They said, we've got to bring this to a war, and we got to make it hurt so that it'll come to an end. Now, we're going to jump families, and we're going to go to William Wilson Beard. This is John Wesley. William Wilson is his father. We really don't know much about him. One of the problems with a lot of these folks is they were tenant farmers, and so there's no land records for them. And he was born after the Civil War, so he wasn't involved in the military. So since we can't get anything on him, we're going to jump to James Rose Beard and John J. Beard. These are father and son who served together through the Civil War. Forgot I had that in there. James Rose Beard is buried up in Groesbeck. It says here, Private Prudence Battalion. That's wrong. It's Prudence Battery is what it, battalion is a big thing. You'll see Prudence Battery is not, of the Georgia Artillery. The Beards lived in Clay County, Georgia. Little town community of Cotton Hill, not far from Fort Gaines, Georgia, and just a few miles from the line with Alabama. Again, we don't have land records, but we know from census and all that that's where they lived. James Rose and John Jay joined Prudence Battery, an artillery group. The artillery group was equipped with the model 1841 bronze smooth bore 6-pounder cannon. They had 4 of them. These were actually obsolete by the time the war came along because they had gone to bigger guns and rifled barrels, but the South couldn't produce all that the way they needed to. So the North had the bigger, better guns, and both sides used this because they had so many of them to start with. But this is what James and John dealt with. Now, today, we would back a truck up here and we'd lift up the tongue and we'd set it on a truck, on a trailer hitch, and drive off. Well, it didn't work that way with a horse. So there's a thing called a limber. I don't know why they call it that, that's just what they call it. And then you attach the horses to the front of it here. And it made for a pretty solid, articulated 4-wheel unit to move the gun around. And some ammunition and stuff went in the box of the limber. You've heard about a caisson. Every gun had a caisson with it. Here's the caisson and the limber that it attaches to. This is for ammunition, explosives, all that stuff. It came with an extra wheel because, you know, things break, so they had an extra wheel with it. Prudence Battery. The whole time, there's a total of 217 men in Prudence Battery. That's why I say battalion is wrong, because this is actually a very small group of people. At that time, a typical artillery battery had a captain and 2 lieutenants in command of it. So there's a captain and 2 lieutenants over the 4 guns. Each gun had a sergeant, a corporal, and a gunner. He's the one that actually did the aiming and, you know, the apogee and calculating how far it was. So the guy that was getting it could cut the fuse to the right length so that when it fired, the fuse would blow it up just as it crossed the enemy. So he had a really important job in the shooting. Now, believe it or not, it took 10 men to fire the cannon. Each one had very specific jobs, and they had to be done in a very specific order. Let me back up here so I can. You see, there's this thing here, they call it a worm. They'd run that down in there in case there was something stuck from the last shell, and then they'd use this sponge and run it down there and make sure that there wasn't any embers left in there, because you don't want embers in there when you throw the next gunpowder in. So, you know, those types of things. And then there was one guy that went to get the shell, and there was another one that put it in, and there was another one that rammed it in, and they followed that procedure every shot. One guy's job was to put his thumb on the vent where the fire went into the cannon. Because again, you don't want a spark going down that vent while they've got it full of gunpowder and you're working on the front of it. That's a hard job, isn't it?
Dangerous job.
Of course, you got to remember, they're shooting at you over there while you're doing this. Okay, 10 men. 10 men, 4 guns. That's only 40 people. What are the rest of the 200 doing? Well, you got things like cooks, and you got people that run what's called the battery wagon. That was like the office that kept some supplies and records in it. And then you had a forge wagon for each group, because things break down and horses need shoes and all that, so they carried their own forge with them to fix things. And then there was an ambulance. If you're lucky, you had an ambulance with your group. So that makes for a few more people, but what about all the rest? Most people have never stopped to consider 4 little guns, what it takes to get it around. Number of horses required for each battery. You got 4 horses per cannon. Typically they had 6, but these are the smallest guns, so I'm saying they only had 4. You take a cannon on a long trip, horse is going to get tired. So you have 4 extra horses, so you can swap them out and let them rest. You have 4 horses for each caisson and 4 backups for each caisson. So you have 64 horses just for the guns. Then you have the battery wagon with 4, and you have extras for the battery wagon, and the forge wagon has 4, and 4 extra for it, and the ambulance had 2, and 2 extra for it, so you have 84 horses that are necessary to move 4 cannons around. Now, Mama used to tell me that her grandfather held Robert E. Lee's horse's rein for him. She was laughing when she said it. She knew that wasn't true, but they were never even the same state. But very likely, James Sumner and John Jay spent a lot of time with horses. Can you imagine moving? And by the time you include all the horses there, you're talking 110 horses that you're trying to take care of. And you got to feed them. You got to carry food. You can't just let them graze. You have to carry food for them. And so the biggest job was the horses in their group. When they signed up, and they signed up late in the war, I don't know exactly why. Somebody said they were maybe impressing them at that point, but James Rose was 15 years old. Another story I've been told, and I think I read it somewhere, but I cannot go back and find it, was that James was a drummer and that John was a bugler. Now, I don't know if an artillery battery has both of those or not. I haven't really checked that out. But one thing about that, the enlistment age was 16, but they would let drummers in at 14. So maybe he really was a drummer. I don't know. I hope to find out someday. So it was in the last year and a half of the war that they joined in. First place they went, remember where that is up there? Atlanta. Now, across the, up north of there, some northern part of that, right outside of Atlanta, is Cobb County. The reason I want to point that out is part of this battle is there. And the other thing that was there was Georgia Military Institute. It was the West Point of the South. Now, what had happened is, of course, their graduates had already been spread out in the forces all over the place. And then when they started getting all the recruits, raw recruits coming in because they needed so many, they sent the upperclassmen of the school out to work on training because they at least had some military training in school. That left the 14 to 16-year-olds at the academy. When Sherman started his march down there, they handed the boys 14 to 16 rifles and said, "You're in the Army now." Now this is actually a painting of the exact same thing that happened at Virginia Military Institute.
These boys.
Boys.
These boys went on the front line and they started dying right away. But they stayed with it to the end of the war. Now there's a cross here, you see that squiggly little line that divides the counties. That's the Chattahoochee River. And they were sent to the Chattahoochee River. When General Johnston, who had been in charge up at Chattanooga, knew that he was going to have to fall back, he sent General Shoup, S-H-O-O-P, sent General Shoup down to build a fortification at the Chattahoochee River. And when Sherman heard what he had ordered, he said, "That can't be. Johnston's too smart to put his fortifications on with his back to a river." But that's exactly what he ordered. So they set up I think it's about a 6-mile line to try to stop them from coming down into Atlanta. And they dug in and they were ready to fight. That's the river. You don't just walk across it. And if the enemy's coming and you got to run, you're in trouble. That's why you don't put your back to a river like that. This is actually one of the land defenses they put in there. Like I said, General Shoup, he designed this point that would come out from the land with room for 15 soldiers on each side so that there's an overlapping fire all the way down the line. They called it a Shoupade. This, it's hard to tell, but there's a little notch there. This was a Confederate gun battery. It's possible that the Beards were at this gun battery. They could have been there as any of the others, I guess. But that's a lot of protection, isn't it? Just a pile of dirt in front of you. I'm showing this next one. You know how the Alamo sits in the middle of town? Well, up in Atlanta, some of the markers and things are right in the middle of town. And this one just happens to be where General Joseph Johnston was relieved of command, partly because of his placement of the defenses at the Chattahoochee River, by Texan General John Bell Hood. And he commanded through the rest of the war as long as he was physically able. This is a map shortly after the Civil War, and it shows the march to the sea. It's not quite the straight line that I showed a while ago. Let's zoom in a little bit on it. And you see Atlanta's over here. This is Milledgeville and Savannah down here. When Atlanta fell, first they were moved from the Chattahoochee back to Atlanta, and then from Atlanta, the Pruden Battery, the boys from the Institute, and a few others were sent to be the Capitol Guard at Milledgeville. They were going to be the defense to stop Sherman's army. They got there, and They found out that it was not going to be a defensible thing. So, from Milledgeville, with Sherman coming from Atlanta, and it only took him 5 days to make that trip, so these things are happening pretty fast. They fell back to the town of Gordon. At this point, it's the, well, let me read what it says here. They call it the evacuation of Gordon. And it says in here, I know you can't read it, but I'll tell you what you need to know. The only troops here were the Corps of Cadets from the Georgia Military Institute, a group of factory and penitentiary guards, and the Roberts Guards, who were paroled convicts. It's kind of a dirty dozen type thing. So you want out of the prison? Well, go fight the war for us.
That'll work.
And they actually went into battle wearing their prison uniforms.
Well,
Yeah, definitely.
In addition to that, there were 3 small militia units. Williams Company of Infantry, Talbert's Company of Cavalry, and Prudence Battery of Artillery. It wasn't a state group, it was a militia group that had been motivated. Total strength in Gordon, 460. They looked up and they saw that the river had been breached and that communications had been cut with Macon down to the southwest. So they said, well, we can't do this, so we're going to evacuate. And from Gordon, they moved down here to a river crossing, a railroad crossing, and a ferry crossing. Now, if you've seen the movie 300 Spartans stood in a tiny little passage through the mountains and held off hundreds of thousands of Persians for, I forget how long. They could do that because the Persians all had to come right in front of them to try to get through. Until some traitor showed the Persians how to come around the back and kill them from the back. Well, that's the situation here. To get through, they were either going to have to come across that railroad bridge or they were going to have to go to the ferry to get across. So, the boys and the prisoners and these other few were sent down here. The night they got there, it got to 13 degrees. And they of course were not really prepared for that. They've been moving and, you know, this is not a good situation. But they did the best they could. They fortified the railroad. In fact, they put one of the guns up on a flat car, rolled it out onto the tracks and said, y'all want to come across? Come on, try. And they ended up shooting at them some. The Union tried to set it on fire, and they got it started at one point, but it didn't, you know, they didn't get it destroyed. So, part of them were at the railroad, and part of them were down at Ball's Ferry. The right wing of Sherman's Corps is coming at them. They have picked up a few extras. They're up to a total of 1,000 soldiers at this point. The problem was Sherman's troops were coming with 28,000. And that's what I'm talking about. A few could hold back a lot. And they held them up there for quite a while. This is a current picture of the area. The railroad is still exactly where it was. The river hadn't moved. And so you look at that and say, well, it's not that big. They could just walk up to the river and start shooting at each other and finish it off. Maps and photos can be deceptive. When you find the whole story, that area is swamp. And you can't move an army through swamp very well. From about here down to here is a 3-mile stretch of railroad that's elevated 20 feet on trestles. So that's what made it so hard for them to try to do anything with that. So they marched back to Toomsboro and came out and started down this road. Oh, by the way, this is a drawing of the bridge at that point, and this is the bridge as it is today. I don't know if it's the original or not, but those pilings look a whole lot like those. These could be the ones that were there at that time. Anyway, they went to Toomsboro and they started this way down to Balls Ferry. The people up here saw what was happening, so they sent 2 of the guns down to Balls Ferry to stop them from crossing over. But by the time they made the trip down here to go around the mountains and stuff, they saw that they were already coming across, so they just turned around, went back, joined up with the rest of the forces, and started falling back. This is a marker that's there, Balls Ferry crossing, November 23rd and 24th, Confederate force of cadets and convicts on parole. That's all, it doesn't describe the others, it just says those. So this is a marker there at that site today. When they found out that they were about to come around behind them, they said, we got to go too. So they took off following the railroad. I don't know if they were on the railroad or just following it, to the town of Millen. Now, you see here, when the right wing got across, some of them went up and joined the left wing, and some of them went cross country here. This was not good farmland. And so people hadn't moved into that area. There were no towns, there were no roads, and there were no farm village. Those guys nearly starved to death because they couldn't find anything to eat. And they got lost. Anyway, they went to Millen, and immediately after they set up, they know we can't defend this place either, so they fell back to Ogochee Church. And, well, that's the Ogochee River. Again, this is another one you don't just walk across. And here is the marker that talks about it. It says number 4.5. That means it's 45 miles out of Savannah on that railroad. At this point, they've got up to 4,000 troops that have been gathered. They sent some out of Savannah to help. They pretty much abandoned that before they really got into a battle there. They went to Savannah. Now Savannah, you can see that it's all swamp around there too. You got the Savannah River here and the Ogochee River up here. There was a little cannon spot here that kept them from the Union from going up the Savannah River, and Fort McAllister here that stopped them from going up to supply from the Ogochee River. Sherman looked at that and said, I know what I'm going to do. He sent a contingent to go and capture Fort McAllister, and that opened up the supply line so that the Union troops got fed. The red lines around there are the defenses that the Confederates had set up. And this is just the far left side of it. This is the same railroad coming through here. And you can see, you can't read it, but there's I think Plain Point Battery and Battery Barnes and AC Battery. And then this one is Unnamed Battery. Our guys and the convicts and the boys were responsible from the railroad over to the river. And so James and John would have been at that battery right there. Somewhere they picked up 2 more guns. There were 6 guns in that battery. A little bit closer, this is where I was going to show the names. But we know they were right there. Once Fort McAllister, and this is Atlantic Ocean over here. Once all the supplies were getting through, Confederates said, we can't stay here. So they put some pontoon bridges up here and they escaped out the back door. They went into South Carolina. They went to Charleston, and then our guys went from Charleston to Augusta, Georgia. That's where Fort Gordon is today. And from there, they went back to Milledgeville. Now, that doesn't make any sense, except remember, there's no supply line to deal with. And so it was safe for them to go to Milledgeville. From there, they were to go to Columbus, Georgia, but the war ended. And somehow, I don't know how, they ended up in Albany, Georgia, where they surrendered. That was good for them because they only had 2 counties to walk home. They were close to home when it was over. Now, James Sumner Wingard. We're going to skip to the other side of the family and follow him through it. Probably most of us have seen his grave there in Thornton, right out of Thornton. And I just love that picture.
Yeah.
He was born in Spartanburg. It was actually Spartanburg District, South Carolina at that point. And before he was 2, he had moved, family had moved to Bartow County. He actually went across the county line and enlisted in Rome, Georgia. He enlisted in the 1st Georgia Cavalry. Now, generally, the cavalry would take their own horse, and it was a big deal for him. He was 15. So I don't know if he had a horse to take or not. But he signed up there. And they sent him up into eastern Tennessee for a while, Cumberland Gap in that area. And then they got the bright idea that since Kentucky was neutral, the people of Kentucky were divided about 50-50 as which side to go in. So they said, we're going to stay out of it. And but we messed that up because we invaded. And the idea was to go up, take Louisville so you could control the Ohio River, and Frankfort. Here's where they came through. Bragg, the general, brought them up this way. They were going to go to Louisville, but General Buell beat them to Louisville. So they had a big battle here at Perryville, and we got whooped. Pretty bad. And this dotted line is their retreat, James Wingard's retreat, back through Chattanooga and up here to Murfreesboro. Murfreesboro was, I believe, number 4 on that list of worst battles. 78,000 soldiers there. 25,000 of them were casualties. Killed, wounded, captured, or missing. A third of all the armies that went in there didn't come out. James came out. Battle of Chickamauga was right after that. There were 125,000 soldiers involved in that. 34,000 casualties. James came out. There's a marker there for the 1st Georgia Cavalry, where they were there at the Chickamauga battlefield. From there, I said Chattanooga was the next place. He was at Chattanooga. There were 121,000, only 13,000 casualties. That was more of a siege than a huge battle. But we lost there. And so he was sent to Milledgeville. Now I find that interesting. Here's both grandfathers sent to the same place.
Wow, that is nice.
From Milledgeville, when they left there, because the Union was coming at them, his group went to Griswoldville, and it's not a big battle, but there were only 6,000 involved, but there was 1,100 casualties, most of them Confederates. We lost that battle big time. And it was, percentage-wise, was as bloody as any of the others. Something I skipped a while ago, down on the corner of this is Andersonville. Anybody ever heard of Andersonville Prison there? It was well known, even during the Civil War. It was that's what this is a drawing of it. The creek that ran through there was their water supply, their washing supply, and their latrine.
It's a nice place.
And disease
It's only a little-
took a lot of them. It was a double wall, and then on this wall you got guard towers all along there. And there were 40,000 soldiers in this 26 acres.
It's okay.
They gave them
You put it on
nothing.
trial.
They put them in there and said, good luck. This is what it looked like in there. The lucky ones had a tent with them when they were captured. The rest built whatever they could out of oilcloth or coats that they had. They would dig. I read the story written by one of the guys. They'd dig a hole and build a berm so the water wouldn't come in, and 4 or 5 or 6 of them would get under there in the winter, try to keep each other alive. This little line across here, barrier, was 19 feet from the wall. Anybody in that area could be shot without warning by one of the guards in the towers. Some of the guys went crazy and intentionally walked out into that area. Now, the South didn't have food. They couldn't barely feed their army, and they couldn't feed all these prisoners. They gave them what they had, what they could. But you've seen the prison camps in Germany, what those people looked like. Well, this is one of the northern soldiers from that place. Captain Wirtz was the commander there. And he was the only one tried for mistreating prisoners. And he was hung right inside of the national capital. He's the only one that paid that kind of penalty. And it really wasn't his fault. He didn't have food to give. At Andersonville, there were 45,000 prisoners. 13,000 of them died from disease, poor sanitation, malnutrition, overcrowding, and exposure to the elements. I mean, they didn't have clothes toward the end. Clothes had rotted off. It was horrible. Now, again, you talk to somebody about prisons in the Civil War, that's the one that comes up. How horrible those Southerners were to the Union prisoners. Yankees in Southern prisons, there was 195,000 of them. Rebels in Northern prisons, there was 215,000. Yankees who died in Southern prisons was 30,000. Rebels who died in Northern prisons was 26,000. South wasn't that much worse than the North in taking care of the prisoners. But you listen to the historians who wrote the history, the winner, the other side is the bad guy. Percent of Yankee prison deaths was 15.5%. The prison rebels death was 12%. So again, there's not that big a difference between them. Andersonville was already known by now. And there was a General Stoneman, as they started leaving Atlanta, that asked permission, because he's real smart. He says, if I go down there and take Andersonville, if I take Macon, Georgia, and Andersonville, I'll be a hero. I'll free all these prisoners and maybe get some soldiers to come with us. How's he going to get those soldiers to work? So anyway, he asked permission and he was allowed to go down there. He was going to take Macon and then go to Andersonville, but he was particularly savage on his trip down there. And when he got to Macon, he met a force of mostly old men and young boys. But they were motivated and they were mad. And they turned them back. The Yankees started marching north back the way they came, but they only made it as far as Sunshine Church. At Sunshine Church, there was a commander from that area that knew they'd have to pass through the valley here in the mountains. So he brought his troops there. And, well, if you remember, Griswoldville, it's only about 10 miles away. So James Sumner went from there to Sunshine Church, and it was the one victory for the South in this whole section of the war. They defeated the guys that were trying to get back from trying to free Andersonville. It's the only win we had during this Georgia campaign. I'm saying we because we're all Southern, you know. Then he went to Savannah. Here's back at the same, you know, two families together again. It wasn't, you know, there were 73,000 soldiers total. Most of them were Union, and that's the reason that they didn't have much of a battle. They looked up at the numbers and said, we're going out the back door. From there, he went up into South Carolina, and from there to Bennett Place, Durham, North Carolina, where he surrendered. It was the last big surrender of the Civil War, and unfortunately, he had 2 states to walk home to get back home. So that's their trip through the battle. Now, I want to look at how we got where we are. The green is Winger, the red is Beard. They're in the same state, but they don't know each other. First, we're going to look at James Rose and John Jay. They actually started out in North Carolina, then they moved straight to Clay County. James Sumner started out in South Carolina. He moved to North Carolina and then to Cass County or Bartow County, Georgia. That's where he met Martha Ann Jones. Most of you probably didn't know that James was married twice. He married Martha Jones. They had a girl, Nellie Grove Winger. And we have just had contact with some of her family. Somewhere along the line, and I can't pinpoint where, Martha died. And the next time we see James, he and Nellie, who I believe is 13 at the time, are in Franklin County, Arkansas. Mulberry, Ozark area, a couple of towns there. Like I said, I want to find where his first wife died, but I just can't find any record. I don't know if, well, I just don't know. This is a map, photo of that area where they lived. Mulberry is what I had always heard is where they lived. This is all Franklin County. And then some of the family was up here at White Rock. And on some of the birth certificates, Emma said that she was born in Ozark. Well, you know, that's the big town. Nobody knows where these other little ones are, so I'll say the big one. So my guess is, oops, oh, I thought I had that. My guess is they lived somewhere in here. This is the Arkansas River coming across here. So they lived and farmed somewhere in that area. They're there. Now, it's interesting, on the way from Georgia to Arkansas, they traveled through, I forget the county's name, but that's where Permelia was born. I don't know if he met her there or if he met her when she moved to Franklin County as well. James Sumner and Cornelia Celia Ann Stepp met and got married, and they had Aunt Grace, Uncle Hill, and Meemaw, her grandma. Now, looks like I've drawn it kind of funny. The reason I did that has to do with the 1900 census. It still amazes me that now we can go and look at the handwriting of the census takers from way back then. And here we've got the Beard family listed here. We've got James Winger, Permelia, Gracie, Hillard, and Emma, son. She's listed as a male, which would have surprised her.
That's funny.
Wow.
Well, I don't know how many times I'd looked at it, and then one day I looked a little closer. This column over here says number of, mother of how many children? It says 4. Number of children living, 3. So probably there was a child that didn't live long in between there. Sometime between, then and 1900, whoever that child was and that we had no record of, was born and died. I always pay particular attention to the babies. They're just important to me because I guess a lot of people just forget them, but I don't want to. After all of that, they moved from Franklin County to Limestone County, where we're all familiar. I say all, most of us are familiar with it. So we're going to jump again to the Beards. They start out here in Clay County, and they move straight to Del Valley, the Garfield area here in Texas. Y'all know we live there? We live there. This is Austin. This is the Austin Airport, and this is Garfield.
Yeah.
Del Valley is between Garfield and Austin.
Yeah.
So they live right about where the airport is,
Yeah.
or right where the toll road goes through. So you've been right by your great-grandparents' place and didn't know it.
Wow.
And we have a lot of family buried at Haney Chapel Cemetery there in Garfield.
Wow.
John J. Beard, who's been following, is buried there. Sarah Gentry, this would be John J. Beard's wife. Their family, the Gentrys, started out in Virginia. From Virginia, they moved to Spartanburg County, South Carolina. Heard that before? That's where James was born. From there, the Gentrys moved straight to Del Valley.
That is funny.
After that, well, the one we're looking at next, Temperance Lottie Hobbs. You know you have a grandma named Temperance?
That's nice.
They called her Tempers. I don't know why, that's just, they shortened it. Their name was Temperance Lottie Hobbs. They started out in North Carolina. From there, they moved to Clay County, Georgia. And I have a feeling they may have moved at the same time to Del Valley, Texas. You also have Ira Castleberry. We mentioned that earlier. Ira Castleberry is, John Wesley Beard's mother was Mary. Her father was Ira. He's buried up at Garfield. They started out in Pennsylvania, as close as we have to Yankees in the group. But they didn't stay there long. They moved pretty quick down to Virginia. And from there, they moved to the county next to Spartanburg and stayed there for a little while. Then they moved to Dade County, Georgia, right where Chickamauga took place. From there, they moved to Del Valley.
That's just crazy.
So, you look at this, there's a lot of decisions in there about where somebody's going to live. And if any one of those decisions, any of them, had been different, we wouldn't be here today.
That's right.
But all these things came together to bring the Beards to the Austin area. Now, we have them in Limestone County and down here in Austin. What happened in Garfield is, to me, the saddest story of this whole thing. In Garfield, I found this tombstone. It says, Hiram, son of G.M. George M. and Ida Castleberry, born 1890, died 1906, age 16 years, 6 months, and however many days. I had heard about this, but I didn't have a name, I didn't have a place, I didn't have a time, anything. But I finally came across this next thing, and then I found Hiram's grave. I found this article in the Dallas Morning News, dated December 30th, 1906. It says, dies from the effects of a small bullet received in the head.
Oh,
Austin, Texas. Hiram Castleberry, age 16 years, died in a sanitarium, that just meant hospital back then, in this city, in Austin, as a result of being accidentally shot. The wound was made by a ball from a .22 caliber rifle, which entered the eye and lodged in the head of the unfortunate boy. The gun was in the hands of a young cousin, and the boys were preparing to go hunting when the accident occurred. The gun was being tested when it unexpectedly went off. No blame attaches to the young cousin, and he is mere distracted with grief. The dead boy was the son of George Castleberry, who lives on a large farm below the city. That's a sad story all by itself. But the cousin holding the gun was John Beard.
oh, no.
And that affected him the rest of his life. Most of us didn't know this back when we were young. But he was holding the gun when it went off and killed his best friend cousin. This was all right after Christmas.
Yeah.
It says December 30th. I think that the accident happened on the 27th. One of them, I don't know which, had gotten that gun for Christmas. And John didn't drink. We went to the pool halls a few times, and I saw him drinking beer. No big deal. But from what Nita and I think my mama told me, come Christmas time, he'd start drinking.
Oh,
And he didn't ever learn how to drive, so he'd get somebody to take him to Hiram's grave, and he'd stand there and cry. And it got so bad, nobody would take him there again. He just couldn't handle, even though it was so long before, and it was an accident, nobody blamed him. It affected him. And so he'd take a few drinks every Christmas because it was bothering him so. Now, don't get me wrong, he was as good a man as any I've ever met. But this awful thing happened in his life, and it affected him. Not too long after that, it was several years, they moved from Dell Valley to Limestone County. It's always perplexed me that so many of the Beards moved to Austin and then moved backwards to Limestone County, moved east, where everything else had been headed west. Some of the family had already settled there, was the reason. Ira Castleberry, I want to talk about him for a minute. This is Ira's grave up at Garfield. I want to go back and clean it sometime. He'd be our uncle. Ira also was in the Confederate Army. And I haven't traced him a whole lot, but I do want to say that he was at the Battle of Vicksburg. Vicksburg was the key to the whole war. Once the Union took Vicksburg, they had control of the Mississippi River, and it changed everything. One of my father's relatives, one of his grandfathers, was a cavalry guy over on this side. So there's several places I found where our families were shooting at each other. And Ira was in Stevenson's group down here. Now that looks like it's a long way from where most of the battle place took place, and it did. Most of it was up in this section. But there was a siege there, and the people inside Vicksburg were starving. They tried everything. They attacked straight twice and got beaten back so bad that they just went into siege. One thing they did was, right about here, they dug a tunnel from way back here up under the lines, under a battery there, packed in 1,200 pounds of black powder. Sealed it off, lit the fuse, and it blew a hole 40 feet wide and 20 feet deep. There's one guy that claimed he was in a tunnel right there at that time, that he was blown up and out of the ground and survived. The Confederates were in here. The concept was blow up, rush through the gap and run in and take the city. Problem was, it made a crater. And as the Union guys were trying to go up out of the crater, Confederates just, shoot them. Then they started taking artillery shells, lighting them and rolling them down the hill. So they couldn't do it. They finally surrendered. And this was Ira's first lieutenant. I just happened to come across a picture of him as I was studying. When you want to follow him in battle,
Yeah.
there's a couple of the other guys that were with him. And one is just a kid. Yeah. I was amazed when I found this next document. The city fell on July 4th, like a day or two after Gettysburg. It fell there, and this document is dated July 8th. Now, what do you do when you capture 10,000 enemy? What they would do is parole them. They'd give them a paper that says, don't fight us anymore unless you're legally swapped for prisoners, and you can leave. This is Ira Castleberry's parole paper. And apparently, Ira couldn't write, so he signed an X, and his captain had to co-sign that he was who he said he was.
That is.
And I followed Ira from there, and he ended up going into another unit after he was swapped. He went into another unit and went up into the Cumberland Gap area and fought up there. But it amazes me, this is very specific Vicksburg, and they're issuing this 4 days after they captured the place. They printed some stuff up fast and filled out papers. And he was like the second or third day that they were issuing the papers. Ira Castleberry was captured July 4th. He was exchanged, went into the 29th Infantry, went to Cumberland Gap. Their group was in Nashville. They were in Bentonville. They were in Chattanooga. Here we are back there again. And when they surrendered at the end of the war, there were only 177 fit for service. So they had quite an attrition. Temperance Hobbs. Now, Temperance didn't go in the Army, but her brothers did. And I found their brothers about 18 miles north of here, up at Lytton Springs. Thomas Muse Hobbs, Temperance's brother, spent from September 29th to May 5th, 63 and 65, in Camp Douglas, Chicago. That doesn't mean anything, right? Camp Douglas it's in Chicago now. That land is almost downtown now. It was the Andersonville of the North. And talk about cold in the winter. He spent a year and a half under the same conditions that Southerners were. Now, the sad part of it, the Southerners, I said, couldn't feed their prisoners. They didn't have food to feed them. Up north, they said, they're treating our people in Andersonville bad. We're not going to feed the prisoners here. So they starved the Confederate soldiers that were at Camp Douglas in retaliation for the conditions in Andersonville. They had food, but they wouldn't give it to them. Who wrote the history? The ones that won. This is the diagram of the place. They at least had some housing that they could get in out of the snow. Camp Douglas, Chicago, Illinois. Total prisoners, 26,000. It wasn't as big as Andersonville. Deaths, 4,454. 17% of the people that went in there died. Ira got home. He was paroled at the end of the war and came home. This is a memorial built there at Camp Douglas for the people that died there. Eugene Middleton Hobbs is his brother. He was too young for the Civil War. He moved up here to Lytton Springs and for some reason killed himself drinking carbolic acid. Now it's used in a lot of things. It can be a cleaner. It was also used a little bit as medicine. So you might think overdose, but it specifically says on his death certificate, suicide by drinking carbolic acid. Now this is going to seem far out in left field for a minute. When we went to Paul's graduation in Camp Benning, coming back, we stopped and looked at some of my family stuff. And right there in the middle of that circle, we found where one of my grandfathers lived in 1830. We got to go to the property, take pictures of it and all that. You say, what does that have to do with us? Well, this is just a little bit farther out. If you look right up here, you see the town of Wingard, Alabama.
Y'all got some name in the paper.
That's 3 miles apart.
That's cool.
My father's family and my mother's family
That's wild.
lived 3 miles apart in 1830s
Wow.
and probably knew each other.
Isn't that
Now, these aren't, the Wingers there are not direct descendants for me, but they're cousins.
Wow.
And we went to the cemetery and there's a bunch of graves for Wingards there in that place. It's not much of a town now. There's a little store there. Looks like it's about 150 years old. And that's about all that's left.
That's cool.
When we left there, we headed southwest back toward Texas and we went to Castleberry, Alabama. And we found a whole bunch of cousins buried in Castleberry, Alabama. All this to get to
Yes.
the two that mean so much to most of us. The question came up, where'd they live? And I've asked, people say, well, there was a windmill, and you know, if any of you were taken there as a child and can remember where it is, you let me know. But in digging, I found out that they lived on High Hill Road. And High Hill Road is only 2 miles long between there and there. They lived somewhere in that circle. That is northwest of Thornton. Did you see it back? Yeah, see Thornton down here in the corner. It grows back up here. So they lived somewhere along that road. A lot of us, for some reason, I always thought since Cobb Cemetery was out, northeast of Thornton, that they lived somewhere northeast of Thornton. but they live northwest of California. In Cobb Cemetery, we have John Beard, Emma Beard, James and Cornelia Winger, and Orville and Avis, our aunt and uncle. Up in Thornton Cemetery, actually in town, is William Wilson Beard and Mary Castleberry Beard. William Wilson is John Beard's father, so he'd be her great-grandfather. Up here is his father, James Rose Beard, just out of Thornton, Falconberry Cemetery. What's strange to me about it is his daughter is buried there with him. You find his wife, Temperance, buried down here at Tidwell Cemetery. And with her, one of their sons, George Washington Beard. Does anybody know where the Pleasant Grove School that our ancestors went to? It's somewhere around Thornton. Now, some people say it's the school building that's there now. I'm not convinced of that. But because Pleasant Grove is an area right down in here. And I'm thinking that Temperance was living here, and they just said, well, we don't want to go all the way up to Rosebank, we'll just bury her here. It's the best I can come up with. We are heavily invested in Limestone County. We got people buried in all of these places around that part of the world. And it's been fun for me to find them all. And to remember every one of these were important people. Maybe not to the people that write the history books. Maybe their name never got put in lights. But every one of these people lived a life that now is remembered by us. And if we forget them, it's gone. That's why I spend so much time studying all this. Maybe it doesn't come to any good end. Maybe it's just an exercise in futility. Maybe it's just my curiosity. But I want to keep these people real. That's why I'm trying to get all the pictures and I'm trying to write all this stuff down. And that's why it's so important to me that you thought that this gathering was important. And I just want to say, be careful when you leave here, because we love you all. We want you to get home safe and come back. Like I said, in 20 years when we have the next one.
Let's have it before 20 years,
Yeah.
please.
I hope so.
Yeah.
I feel like we're gonna have it at Austin Airport.
Yeah, Garfield.
I would love to know exactly where that was, but I know it's between Garfield and Austin, so it can't be far from it.
It's on runway 3.
Runway 3.
Jimmy, do we, I mean, I don't know, maybe somebody has more, but I was just curious, we know that they were in that small area, but we have any details on how they got together? I mean, we've seen the pictures where they're young and together, but just curious.
Nope.
Didn't
Don't have
know
a
if they went
clue.
to church together.
Church probably had something to do with it, because they went to the Haney Chapel Methodist Church
Okay.
in Garfield.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay, okay.
And so maybe they met at church, I don't know.
Curious.
Wish I did.
Yeah, just curious.
Well, we have some more. Why don't you put all the papers back in and draw out another name?
Yeah, and then I'll get another bunch.
Well, can I say something?
Yeah. I know that was a lot, shit all I cut out. The story is so much bigger. There's so many more people. My family tree on Ancestry has 11,000 people in it. And because I go off on families and just go where I don't belong, you know, I follow trails and I like doing that. You know, and their commercials say, you put this up there and you'll get a leaf and you can find out. My problem is I've got over 44,000 leaves to follow.
Whoa. We're big here. We go back a long way.
But you'd be selected and you work at it that way. My thing is available to anybody that wants to review it on Ancestry. If you want to review this whole thing, just let me know and I'll give you a link so you can go in and look at the whole tree. There are stories written into all this that are just amazing. John Beard had a brother named Ira. And in the 30s, Ira was in a car wreck and really messed up his hip real bad. And he lived several years, but it got infected and he was homebound, bedbound. But he wanted to be at church. So in the 30s, the pastor rigged up a two-way radio system.
Wow.
So he could lay in bed and not only hear church, but talk back to him as well.
That's nice.
Yeah. He didn't get to use it very long, but that tells me he must have been some special person for him to go to that kind of trouble to keep him included in what was going on. And, just that kind of story. Little things that, what difference does it make? Makes a difference to me.
Hey, Jimmy, speaking of the separation in the cemeteries, my grandpa, my daddy's daddy, F. Polk, he was buried in Cox Cemetery, and my grandmother was buried in another cemetery, in Cox Cemetery, and Daddy's daddy was buried in Limestone. And the reason for that, I asked, because my grandmother was mean, and she didn't want, he didn't want to be buried by her.
Really?
That's the reason why. Yeah. She's mean.
Just a few weeks ago, I was going through some stuff and I came across this birth certificate with John Wesley Beard and Emma Frances Winger. Birth certificate of John Connor Beard. And I thought, who is John Connor Beard? Did they have another one I didn't know about? Well, in 1955, Emma went in and filed a name change. It was written down on the birth certificate wrong. That's actually Barnett Connor Beard. Now, I got to thinking, when I was looking at things in Clay County, I had noticed that the third line there is Barnett W. Beard. I thought, maybe that's where he got his name. And then I remembered something else on that first one. Oops. The name of the doctor is J.B. Barnett. That's another possibility. Did y'all ever know?
Yeah, Mama said that he was named after two doctors.
Okay. Well,
That's what Mama did.
oh, that confirms what I had thought then. That's where his name came from, was the doctor.
So let me ask you, the child that James had with his first wife, I think I heard you say that when he moved to Arkansas, she might have been around 13?
Right.
Okay. Just so everybody, I had no idea that he had been married before until just recently, because somebody got on Ancestry and identified me as a relative and reached out to me and said, I think we're related. Here was my mother, and going, okay. Of course, the thing I did immediately was get with Jimmy and say, Jimmy, who is this person? Well, apparently she lives in Vidor, and she's the granddaughter of the daughter who he had in the first marriage. And so, of course I encouraged her to come to this, but apparently she wasn't able to. But I'm just wondering, do you have any knowledge of what happened to that child? She was 13 when...
Oh, I've got a whole life story.
Okay.
Yeah,
Is all this going to be in the book?
a lot of it.
Good.
Yeah. I followed her family all the way down to the one that you talked to. She lived a full life, and she did well. There was another one. Well, I was going to say earlier, I got a contact on Monday of this week from a fella that, forget where he lives now. somewhere not far from Groesbeck, I think. And turns out he is Grace Wingard's grandson. And I invited him to come. He said, I'm old and I can't do that. But, you know, and we got together because of that DNA test.
Wow.
So let me encourage you, whether you do all this or not, take the test. It shows you amazing things, and it's confirming what I've already got back to the 5th great grandparents, genetically proving all of these people. So you get a chance to take it and see where your other side of the family came from.
Same place.
Check up on
Brock
Rousey
took the
Green.
test.
Sure.
Brock took the test and he was like 3% baboon. Where'd that come from?
We can't figure out where that came from.
There was a small portion, what it did on 23andMe, it confirmed the Norwegian Viking piece. The part that was puzzling is it said Congolese and Filipino on a part of it. But